Hi everyone, I'm Amy Smart, and today I'm going to do just a quick little tutorial on how to make my Holiday Patchwork Forest tree block. If you're part of the Quilt Along, welcome. We're so glad you're joining, but you don't need to be part of the Quilt Along. This is just a simple tutorial for this very fun and simple block pattern that you can make in any size. You can make your little Holiday Patchwork Forest whatever size trees you want. Here's our finished block. I'm going to just walk through the steps really quickly of how to cut multiple blocks at once, piece them back together, and square them up. All right, so the first thing we're going to do when we make this block, we start with multiple layers of fabric. You can cut up to 6 layers of fabric at a time, whatever you're most comfortable with, and your rotary cutter. I like to do 5 or 6 at a time because then I can get a variety of blocks, I can get a variety of prints shuffled in throughout, or you can just start with 2, just do 2 at a time and make 2 mirroring blocks. So here I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And just a little tip on stacking your fabric. I stack my fabric with contrasting colors and patterns because then all I need to do is shuffle one tree and voila, I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So I've got a variety of colors, patterns. They're different next to each other. Okay, this will work with any size rectangle block. And this is a little more freeform than the original block tutorial. I'll put that in the notes at the bottom of the post. This one's a little more freeform. I'm going to actually cut down my fabric just a little bit to start with. If you are making the Pine Hollow pattern, you will be told in that pattern exactly what size rectangles to start your block with, but I'm just going to play with this size today. All right, so to make my trunk block, I just cut off a strip at the bottom. That wasn't even straight, and I'm not worried about it. And then just cut that strip in half and set those aside. Those are going to be on either side of the trunk at the bottom. Now, I should have got a longer ruler, but I'm not going to worry about it. Now I'm going to cut my trees, and I just freehand cut the trees. The one tip to keep in mind is don't cut too close to the edge. For a bigger size block, I would come in, like 1.5 inches. If it's one of these little blocks that I'm cutting, I would come in at least 3/4 of an inch. That way you don't cut off the tip of your tree. Okay, and just freehand pull that first stack away. And also, the other tip is don't cut too close to the top. That's a nice pretty pine, but we need lots of space for squaring up this block. So I cut it a little shorter so I have lots of space at the top. All right, now I've got my 3 stacks, and here's where the magic happens. I just shuffle one tree, and I'm ready to start sewing them back together. All right, so now that I'm ready to start sewing things back together, I take my first tree, and my first seam is right here. I start sewing in the opposite order that I cut. So I'm going to start with this shorter seam first, and I'll just sew a 1/4 inch line right here. When I go to press it, there will be this little gap. And I lay my ruler down, trim that off, and then I'm ready to sew the second one. As you can tell, I am not super worried about this lining up. I'm just adding them right back on. So here's the steps. Oh, first of all, so you can see now I've got trees that contrast with the fabrics. It's just already stacked up, ready to go. Let's move these out of the way, and I'll show you the next steps. All right, so here's a stack of trees that I already cut, and I've got them partially sewn together. So here's this first one, just like we saw previously. Obviously, it's a smaller size because you can make whatever size you want. I would sew my first seam, second seam, and then I have my two pieces that go on opposite sides of the trunk. And I will sew these two to both sides of the brown trunk. As you can see here, I just cut an assortment of widths. Again, very free form. These are obviously longer for these taller pieces. I wouldn't need them as long for if my strip is shorter. Let's pull this out of the way. So once I've sewn my pieces on either side of the tree, I press I press towards the tree on one and away from the tree. Again, it's just not a big deal because we're not worrying about seams matching up later. Just give it a nice press with your iron. Make sure those seams are nice and flat. Here is where I've sewn my trunk on either side. You can see it's a little wonky, and that's okay. Now, if I were to just sew it like this, my trunk is obviously off center. So I want to center my trunk under my tree and sew that together. Before I do that, I want to, this one's already actually squared up pretty nicely. Here's an example of where it's, all I've done is start piecing that back together. And I chose to kind of line up these seams here, so it made this really off on this end. So before I sew my trunk piece together, I'll just clean that up and give it a nice square edge. I would do the same thing with, put this out of the way. With this edge too. It's not straight. So I'll do the same thing. Just square up that edge so that it's straight. I'm ready to sew. All right, now I'm gonna show you how I sew this base onto my tree. Super simple, 1/4 inch seam allowance. I didn't even pin. You can if you want to, especially maybe if it's small or you're worried about things slipping. Here's my tree block. I'm gonna give it a quick press. Follow me to the iron. And I press away from the tree towards the trunk. And I press from the top. And you can see I could have worried about lining up my gingham, but I didn't worry about it. Now I've got my block ready to square up, and I will predetermine ahead of time what size I want my blocks to be. Let's make this one, let's do 7.5 by 6.5. So I find the center. I'm gonna have it 6.5. I want my tree to be centered in that. So half of 6.5 is 3 1/4. So we'll go like this and get that point. Since I have, this is where it's handy to have a ruler to the size of the block you're making, but this time I will just use my mat as a little bit of a guide to get that 6.5 inch width. And now 7.5 inches tall. So you can see with my 6-inch rulers, adding an 1.5 inches. Make sure that's nice and flat. Trim. And there's my finished patchwork pine tree block. These tree blocks are meant to be really simple, not stressful. If this is the first time you've made an improv block, I suggest using some old fabric that you don't really care about and making a few practice blocks so you can get the hang of the piecing, the squaring up, if you cutting, and that way if your points, your tree points don't work out or you make a mistake, you're not going to stress about it. This is just make a few practice blocks. I promise you, once you've made a few, you will be on fire. You'll get through these so quickly. They come together so quickly. Please leave any comments with questions. I'm happy to help. I think you'll have a lot of fun. I know these have been a popular block, and I'm looking forward to you trying it too.